I'd like to explain what grid modernization is. And it really involves two essential features. One is to reinforce the grid, make it stronger and make the grid more resilient. The other is to make the grid much smarter. Make it smarter by putting in automated controls, by putting in sensors, by putting in monitors. Now, why is that important? It's important because the grid is changing substantially. It used to be a one-way flow of energy, now it's a multi-dimensional flow of energy. And this multi-dimensional flow of energy is provided because we have what we call distributed energy resources. These are customers owning their own power supplies, such as rooftop solar. This is demand response. These are windmills. These are electric vehicles, a whole array of newer technologies. And one of the things that the utility's got to be able to do in order to protect reliability and resiliency is to have some visibility over these sources. So grid modernization involves making the grid much smarter, using some of the best technologies. And you want to do that because you want to give the customer a broad array of options. Customers should have the opportunity to manage their own energy supply, should have the opportunity to produce their own electricity, but you don't want to put in jeopardy reliability or the resiliency of the grid. So that's really what grid modernization is. And the issues that we're dealing with are issues, how do you price the services that are provided from the grid? First, what are the essential services? You know, reliability is tied to a lot of engineering terms, and one of those terms is called voltage. It's a forcing. It kind of maintains the pressure on the grid. Frequency is very, very important. All of these are what we call essential reliability services. And these services have to be provided from these third-party sources now that are a part of the grid. So that's a big issue. The other is, as an example, rooftop solar or private solar. Those customers use the grid. When the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, if for renewables, you have to rely on that grid. That grid was priced in a way where it was priced on the amount of sales that you did, volumetric. Today, it's got to be priced very differently because there are infrastructure costs. There are costs associated with building the overall infrastructure of the grid. Everybody who uses that grid needs to pay for it. That's a huge issue that we're dealing with. As an industry, as a private industry, we are committed to, in 2016, investing as much as $52 billion in the electric grid and modernizing that grid and making it a smarter energy infrastructure. $32 billion at the distribution level, $20 billion at the bulk power level, the large wires, the transmission system. So what we are doing is our members individually are going before the regulatory commissions and making the case why they need to make these investments. So we're working with our members. We work with them in several ways. First, we hold a series of dialogues with state commissioners. State commissioners are very, very important because they have to approve the changes in rates that companies will need in order to finance the infrastructure that they're building. So we work with our companies by holding educational forums with the state commissioners. There are 3 major meetings that are held annually with state utility commissioners through the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. So we make sure that those agendas are robust, they deal with these issues. We frequently have our CEOs participate in these dialogues surrounding the grid. We're doing something else. We have a forum that we call a Critical Consumers Issues Forum, where we pull in regulators and we pull in consumer advocates. We pull in a range of stakeholders that are impacted by investments. And we have a dialogue with them. We try to explain why we're making the investments. We give our member companies the opportunities to interact with the state commissions. It's kind of an off-the-record conversation, but it's a very valuable conversation. So we reach out, we educate. Finally, we participate in those regulatory proceedings. So I have frequently testified in proceedings with respect to the whole need for grid modernization. Not just state commission proceedings, but legislative proceedings. I participate in a lot of broad forums. In fact, many of us do participate in forums. You participate in forums too. These are critical forums to really fundamentally explain the basis of our industry and the need for grid modernization. The issues that we're dealing with are global in nature. Grid modernization isn't a domestic issue. Grid modernization is a global issue. Many of our international members are actively involved in some of the issues that we're addressing. So as an example, I mentioned that we have distributed energy resources. One big distributed energy resource is called energy storage. Energy storage has many functions. It can be a power supply component. It can help enhance your transmission system. It can help enhance your energy, your distribution system. It could be very beneficial to a customer who has rooftop solar because it will be a backup when the sun isn't shining. A broad array of issues. Well, our international members are dealing with this issue very substantively. So we're looking at proceedings that are involved overseas, and we're learning, we're dialoguing through Lawrence Jones's leadership. We're having a lot of dialogues, and these dialogues are really beginning to take some major focus. But we're having these dialogues so we can learn lessons from experiences that they have, and at the same time, we're dealing with some issues that they're not dealing with. So for example, all of these issues, one big issue is called cybersecurity. You know, we rely extensively on the internet. We rely extensively now on the electric grid. All of these technologies are controlled through what we call microprocessors. And these microprocessors have a cyber component to them, obviously. So one big concern that is shared not just domestically but internationally is how do we protect the grid from a cyber attack. So we're involved in ongoing dialogues with our international members about how we can best put in the technologies to make sure that the grid remains reliable and resilient. And the other thing which I think is important, also tied to grid modernization, is that overseas, as for example in Germany and other nations, in Australia, they have a higher concentration of distributed energy resources. So we can look at their experiences and we can learn from those experiences. We can learn where we can locate those resources. We can learn increasingly what impact they have on operations. We can learn how we can price them a lot better. We can learn the implications on the electric consumer. So these dialogues are very vital. I said that was my last point. One more point. We've created an advisory team because grid modernization is a huge topic. It involves energy storage. It involves, as I mentioned, electric vehicles. It involves rooftop solar. It involves so many technologies that are using the grid as a platform. So this is an evolution, a transformation that's taken place in the industry. So we need to have a dialogue. So we've created a working team of advisors, of experts throughout the U.S. who are dealing with these issues. We're similarly creating a working team of our international members. And we'll have cross-border dialogues about these cross-cutting issues and the kinds of things that we can do to keep the grid resilient, to keep it reliable, to provide a broad array of options for the customers. And I think that's going to be very, very beneficial. Give us the opportunity, too, to look into the future, to look at newer technologies, and to equip ourselves for those technologies. So not only can we keep the lights on, but we can grow the business. The grid that I see is a grid that has a substantial reliance on artificial intelligence, where you can have predictive models, where you can anticipate transactions that are going to occur, where all the technologies that you use now are technologies that are dictated through artificial intelligence, where data analytics is very different. Today, data is very important, but you have to structure, you have to know how to use the data, you have to make the data accessible, you have to make the data so that it assists you in your operations and your planning. So I see a very vibrant future, but a future that's substantially reliant on data analytics and artificial intelligence.